Hey, St. Paul, this is Pastor Justin here to talk about this month's biblical reflection on our outreach theme, human trafficking and our faith. And before we get any further, I just want to make sure that as we start this conversation, that we have a working definition of what human trafficking is. And so I'm going to give you uh, something I created to help us figure out what human trafficking is and how our faith has been responds and has been affected by human trafficking. So here's some definitions in which I want us to work with for the next few minutes. One, human trafficking has a victim, what I call a criminal, and a benefactor. So the victim loses freedom or has their choices dramatically limited. The victim is always someone who is constricted by the process of human trafficking, that they do not feel that they do not have freedom of choice, freedom of movement, or freedom to move from their job or their situation. Their freedom has been limited by the human trafficking. The victim is then used or neglected or forced into various acts. And so, because they do not have ultimate and complete freedom of choice, they then can be used. They are considered vulnerable. Then they can be either used for their body, their mind, or their work, and then often have neglected and less humane situations to work under, or can be forced into criminal or antisocial kind of acts. And so the victim of human traffic is someone who loses their freedom or dramatically loses their choices. Then, because of that vulnerability, they are used or neglected or forced into acts. Then there is the criminal, and the criminal here then grooms the victim to create this bondage. The relationship between victim and criminal is often intimate and close, and so the criminal often grooms that relationship into a certain amount of trust or or coercion. The criminal often limits the freedom of the victim, and then the criminal then directly and criminally often advances due to the victim. So the victim is something that benefits the criminal. And then also a part of human trafficking is the benefactor. The benefactor benefits the victim. Excuse me, the benefactor benefits from the victim's service and the criminal's acts. Sometimes the benefactor can be breaking the law, that receiving the benefits of both the criminal and the victim, or can be blissfully unaware that they are participating in human trafficking altogether. And so to help us understand some concrete evidence or concrete examples of what that might be, here are three different examples. One, probably the most familiar to our American context is the prostitute, the pimp, and the John. So the prostitute has their freedoms limited and their choices limited by the pimp, and the pimp then uses the prostitute to sell themselves, or uses the prostitute to sell the prostitute's attention and acts, and then benefits from that selling of the prostitute. Then also the benefactor is then the John who participates with the prostitute. Now here the John is illegal, and that the John cannot go after the prostitute and get the benefits from it. So that's how the three different things work in that situation. The other ways that it works is the slave or indentured servant. That is then the victim. The owner is then the criminal, and then the buyer is the benefactor. So you can be a criminal, an owner that creates a unhealthy and unsafe working condition for a slave in which they don't have a freedom to move from and in and out of the job, that there's no other opportunities or they limit the opportunities, or the owner has the ability to limit any other opportunity that the slave may have. And then there is the buyer. And so sometimes the buyer may not understand that they are truly benefiting from criminal behavior of an owner and a slave. That may be agricultural with your food that's on your plate or the clothes that are on your back. And so where your food chain or where your supply chains for your product comes from matters, because sometimes there is inappropriate slave owner relationships behind the scenes for your product. A debated situation for human trafficking is around inmates, prisons, and society. Inmates can be a victim um, if the punishment outdoes the crime. And oftentimes prisons can abuse the inmate and use them for services in which they get no benefits from. And then also then society is the benefactor of that. Now in America, this is probably not that big of an issue, even though I'm sure there's areas in which this is an issue. But in many other countries outside of America, the prison system isn't highly as regulated or provide a really humane situation for the inmate. I know there could be debates on what you would think if an inmate is truly a victim, if they are someone who would disdain the crime, and that's probably for another day. But that is another issue in my eyes of a possible human trafficking. Um, so some of the things that to help us understand here is that most victims are women, 80%, and this is global, and most victims are 16-year-old or below. And this is for all human trafficking, both in service sector, or inmate sector, or prostitute sectors. Each one of these things, 80% of women and 16-year-olds below 50%. Mostly because those two are probably the most globally insecure and vulnerable groups. Oftentimes in America, we believe that prostitution is probably one of the only ways in which we understand human trafficking. But globally, and especially here in Detroit, we have to understand that the domestic servitude, agriculture, and factories are also play on a major role in human trafficking. Unsafe, inhumane working environments is as much of a issue as prostitute when it comes to human trafficking. As you can see here, 40%, 46% of prostitution is 40. Human trafficking is 46% prostitution, and 54% slave labor or domestic servitude. So that's just some interesting perspective there. Also, to understand the perspective, when we look at our story of faith, our story of faith is mostly based on the domestic servitude and slave experience, both agricultural and service oriented. When we look back at the story of the Israelites, it's often from the inappropriate labor stance than prostitution. A few passages here, and we're going to start in Exodus. Now, Exodus is important because this is the first time that Jewish people within the scripture are creating their own society, their own formed rules and laws. And so here we have 2021 as they're trying to figure out what is right when it comes to good behavior. And here it may be a little unsettling because the rules from 1200 years before Christ are a lot different than our modern rules, and even the rules in which Jesus was living in. So you can easily remember the idea of do not commit adultery, which is having sex outside the marriage that you've been set with. But you may not have heard these passages. This is from 21, 7 through 11. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who is designated for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. If he does not do these things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment or money. So the hard thing to hear here is that a man sells his daughter as a slave, and that sounds ruthless and cold. But oftentimes that was those who are in the most harshest of situations needed to find ways to support their family, and this would be one of the ways in which they felt like they had to. And so this was something actually in cultures outside of Judaism that happened all the time. Children sacrifice and selling was something that was accepted. And so for in the Jewish culture here, it was really important to address it. They didn't ban it, but they addressed it in a way in trying to create a more humane situation for the daughter and everyone involved. The idea in which if he takes another wife, she shall not diminish the food or clothing and marital rights, that this daughter and those involved should not be trafficked or limit their freedom or limit their basic needs by the man in question here. So the idea that human trafficking is still happening, but the Jewish people are trying to write a lot of laws in which to try to create a more free and just society, even in what we would see the criminal act of trafficking here as. Um, Trafficking is also something that can be warrant death. We have here in 21 that whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Um, and then the relationship between slave and master. Both the Jewish people were slaves, and the Jewish people were also slave holders. So there's rules on that in 21 as well. Now these are the rules that you shall set before him. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve for 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go free for nothing. If he comes in single, he should go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives a wife, and she bears him sons and daughters, that wife and children shall be the master's, and shall go out, and he shall go out alone. But if a slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free. I will not go out free. So this is an experience in which Jewish people enslaved their own and put in this indentured servitude of their own and created rules to go along with it. And it's important to kind of say that in this situation they're trying to make it more humane, because whatever the slave comes into the relationship they get to take out of it. But if they get married, they have to leave that behind, because at this point the Hebrew slave is still a product. Now, the hope of this story is that the slave will plainly say, I love the master, my wife, and my children, I will not go free. That the master is so good at treating these people that they don't feel a need to leave, that their freedoms aren't impinged enough that they feel like they can stay. But again, this is a situation in which Israelites human trafficked their own people, but in the context tried to make it as humane as possible. A couple things from Deuteronomy, which is the next step worth of law outside of Exodus, when the Israelites worked on receiving the promised land and all that came with it. A couple extra laws here in the sense of, you shall not give up the master as slave who escaped from his masters to you. The idea in which Jewish law wanted to say, if a slave escapes a household and he comes and joins your household, you have no responsibility to send it back. There's an interesting understanding in which freedom may be given once you escape. But you still can't steal people from each other, as it says here, and sell them and whatnot. Um, and you have to make sure that you do as right as possible when it comes to how you handle who is betrothed to who. There's a couple passages here from the New Testament. Because many of the lowest of the society were acting like animals and serving like animals, the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it tends out your grain. That is, the laborer deserves his wages." And then, were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself to the opportunity. And so throughout the scriptures, they try to create a more humane situation for the human trafficked. They don't often try to get rid of it, but they also often try to create a more humane situation. So how does our faith respond now with this trials and tribulation of the past, our own history of being both the victim, the criminal, and the benefactor of human trafficking? You can say that our history and our faith has been all three. What do we do about that, or how can we handle this? One, the faithful in the Bible have been in all these roles: victim, criminal, and benefactor. As a victim, the people of faith desired liberation and freedom. So when the people of God were slaves in Israel, were slaves to Egypt, they often desired liberation and freedom and believed that their God would provide it for them. Excuse me. When we were the criminal, when we were the one human trafficking either our own kind or the Canaanites, the people of faith desired to create limitations and fair situations, but often did not live up to their own ideals. They have been, the Israelites may have been better than their Greek or Canaanite neighbors when it came to treating their servants, but they didn't often live up to their own ideals found in their own scripture. Oftentimes, also, the Israelites in our faithful history were often benefit from the forced labor by surrendering armies. So when the Jewish people took over took over the promised land and they enslaved the Canaanites, we benefited from the slave labor of the Canaanite people during the treaty between those two. So today, we should obviously support freeing victims and work against criminal behavior, even in ourselves or in our society. We should also be aware of how we have been benefited by historical and human trafficking, and with what goods we want to buy and what services we receive. We may not be benefiting criminally. We may not be understanding that we're doing something wrong, but if we don't take care of what products we buy, what relationships we keep, we can be unaware of how we actually might be supporting human trafficking. So please, this month, please find ways to support our two mission partners, Alternatives for Girls, and and oh my gosh, it's love. And our other work with those who are human trafficking for sex. Find ways to support them. All the links are found on our website. And thank you for watching. Take care.